Welcome to the RTB YouTube live stream event. I'm Ken Samples. I'm one of the staff scholars here at Reasons to Believe. And to give you a little bit about our purpose, throughout this year we have been building bridges with various groups who are involved in the science faith ministries. And we have been talking about areas that we agree, areas we disagree, points of emphasis, and of course, building unity in the body of Christ. And I like to say that it's very important for Christians to practice truth, unity, and charity. That is, truth is a sacred thing in the Christian faith. We should seek it. We should embrace it. But we also need to be aware that unity is important because as Christians, we live in a community, and that community extends further than our private church or even our denomination. And so we want to promote unity and charity. The Apostle Paul says, in effect, we can comprehend the Trinity, but without love, we're nothing. And so we have a very special topic today. We're going to be talking about the fossil record and the Christian worldview. And our goal is to help you as a listener to better understand the facets of the fossil record in light of a historic Christian worldview. Before I introduce our guests, let me give you a little bit of guidance in terms of our ground rules. We're going to have three parts to this program. Part number one, we're going to talk about the two different faith perspectives represented by Reasons to Believe, as well as the Discovery Institute. We'll spend about 20 minutes there. Then we'll move into the substance of our discussion, where we'll talk about the fossil record. That'll be about 40 minutes. And then a great opportunity is part three. That's when you get an opportunity to write your questions in the chat box. Got to put them in there. They'll be sent to me, and we'll respond to those questions. So again, those are the three parts of our emphasis. And so now let me introduce our two guests. We have Dr. Casey Luskin. Casey works with the Discovery Institute. He is the Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture. He has degrees in the earth sciences, in geology, and in law. Casey, welcome to RTB. We're so happy to have you here.
Great to be with you, Ken and Fuzz. It's been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to this.
Great. We also have another guest that all of you know, I'm sure, is Dr. Fuzz Rana. Fuzz is a biochemist, and he is the president of Reasons to Believe. And so, Fuzz, this ought to be a helpful dialogue.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And, I was mentioning to Casey on a podcast we did earlier today that I think I knew you, first met you when you were an undergraduate student at UC San Diego and headed up this idea center. And actually, you turned that into kind of a national organization, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It did, yeah. You came and spoke when we were just a small little club at UC San Diego, Fuzz. But later on, we turned it into a 501c3 nonprofit. And I think at one point, Nature even had an article about us because it was becoming sort of a national movement. So, yeah, it was great to have you there.
Yeah. So, Casey and I have had our paths cross multiple times over the years and consider Casey a friend. And so it's a privilege to be here with Casey and you, Ken.
Very good. Well, let's spend a little time talking about the two organizations. Casey, it seems to me that the Discovery Institute is probably structured a little different than Reasons to Believe. But tell us a little bit about what goes on there, and then maybe we can look at some questions.
Sure. So, yeah, Discovery Institute is a nonprofit. We call ourselves a think tank. We deal with many different issues ranging from transportation to communications to foreign affairs to urban affairs to artificial intelligence to education. We're most well known probably for our work on the topic of intelligent design and Darwinian evolution and that whole question of origins. But we actually do a lot of different projects, self-driving vehicles and, energy efficient use of things. So we do a lot of different projects. So as you can see, some of those projects obviously have nothing to do with religion or science faith. We're not a religious organization. We have a wide variety of folks with different religious backgrounds that either work directly for us or have some connection. Maybe we fund their research or we're one of our fellows. So we have a pretty diverse sort of group of people that we work with. Now, of course, that being said, I think it's no secret that within the Center for Science and Culture where I work, although we do have folks who are not Christians there, we have Jewish colleagues, agnostic colleagues, we work with Hindus and Muslims. Sort of what unites us all is that, we believe that there's scientific evidence for design in nature. But as I was going to say, certainly a large majority of the folks that I work with at the Center for Science and Culture are Christians. I'm a Christian, and that's no secret. But again, because what we're doing is we're looking at whether or not there is scientific evidence for design in nature. And anybody can see that regardless of your worldview or your background. And at Discovery, we really invite anybody, regardless of where they're coming from, who sees evidence for design in nature or who is skeptical of the materialistic consensus view that is out there dominating in the scientific community. If you are a skeptic of the materialistic consensus, if you are a supporter of intelligent design, then as far as we're concerned, we have something very important in common, and we want to partner with people like that, regardless of what their worldview or background might be. So yeah, I've colleagues with different religious beliefs, although I am a Christian, and many Christians that work with us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Fuzz, tell us about reasons to believe.
Yeah, well, if there is a point of difference between Reasons to Believe and the Discovery Institute, it would be primarily really the focus of the organization. Because at the end of the day, our purpose is to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. So we don't even really think of ourselves as an apologetics organization. We really think of ourselves as an evangelistic organization. And so, but the ideas that we use to build that bridge to the gospel from science involve evidence for the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, the necessary role a creator must play in the origin and the design and the history of life. And also we express skepticism about materialistic explanations for origins and for the structure of the universe and the structure of living systems. So many of the ideas and the arguments and the positions we take have a very strong resonance with our friends at the Discovery Institute. It's just that the missions are different, and I think that's really where there's a departure between the two organizations.
Well, let's talk a little bit about worldviews, particularly the Christian worldview. One way, of course, of framing a worldview is thinking about the Christian worldview in terms of 4 successive cosmic events: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Fuzz and Casey, when it comes to creation, a critical part of a biblical worldview would be creation ex nihilo. God creates out of or from nothing. And then, of course, critical would be the creation of human beings, a historical Adam and Eve. Do both of you affirm both of those ideas?
Yes.
Yeah, I certainly do. And I'm a Christian, and I consider myself fairly orthodox. I would want to make a distinction, though, that, some of my elements of my Christian faith, my Christian belief, I would not argue that I could prove those through science,
Okay.
Whereas I think intelligent design, which aims to be a scientific theory, there are some conclusions of intelligent design which are very consonant with tenets of the Christian faith, but I'm not going to claim that I can, prove all the tenets of the Christian faith or even some of the tenets you just mentioned through the theory of intelligent design. It's sort of limited to saying, can we find evidence for design in nature? But to get into larger questions, even questions about who the designer is, may not be directly accessible from the scientific evidence. Although we might be able to say, looking at the Big Bang or fine-tuning, we need a super intelligent being outside of space and time. Okay, fine. Yeah. But, to go beyond that, sometimes goes beyond the scientific evidence is what we would say. Well,
focusing on your own particular views, let's move to the fall. The idea that Adam and Eve rebelled against God, that sin nature to some degree is passed on to all human beings.
Yeah, and of course, as a Christian evangelical organization or a Christian Protestant organization, we would affirm the fall, and that's part of the reason why we see the historical Adam as being so critical. if I could step back just a minute,
Sure.
because I think this may be another place where if there's a difference, it's maybe not a large difference, but a difference between some of the work that we do versus the Discovery Institute. So, for example, I would actually take the position that I think science can push us very close to recognizing that the designer is the God of the Bible,
Okay.
right? And I appreciate Casey's, being circumspect about approaching that issue, but I would argue that part of natural theology, which I see design, is that we could, really mount a case that the designer is probably the God of the Bible. And
Okay.
I would actually draw from work in certain areas of science to support that. So, for example, if we look at archaeology, where archaeologists are picking up rocks and they're saying, "Oh, this rock looks like it's shaped by a hominin, by an intelligent agent," but they can go one step further and they can start to speculate within reason about, well, what is the motivation? What is the capabilities of this intelligent agent? And I think we can do the same thing as Casey was alluding to when it comes to the origin of the universe or the design of the universe. We can say this must be a transcendent cause that's personal, because that is consistent with a beginning of the universe and with the design that we see. Or the constancy of the laws of nature also are consistent with a God who's unchanging. So that's where
Okay.
I would probably say there's a point of departure. I don't think it's a strong point of departure, but and maybe you guys would even be willing to go that far. But so anyway.
Yeah, I mean, some of those points I would agree with. And I certainly do believe that the God of the Bible is the best candidate for the designer. I would say that many of the arguments that would make me conclude that God is the designer are not necessarily always coming from science. We
Right.
have history, we have prophecy fulfilled in the Bible, we have all kinds of apologetic arguments for the historicity of the Christian faith. And that is why many of the reasons why I do believe that the God of the Bible is the designer. But I certainly would agree with you that the claim that there needs to be a super intelligent mind outside of space and time, that is the best, and I think that is coming from the science. That is a good conclusion coming from the evidence from the Big Bang, fine-tuning, and certainly even from biology. You need a designer that is engaged in the universe over the history of life. We'll talk about this. I think that gets you away from deism and pretty close to theism there. Yeah.
Well, creation, fall, redemption, historic Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, all conservative theological systems affirm Jesus is the Son of God, that he's God in human flesh. He's the Savior of the world. We're saved by grace through faith in Christ. Both of you affirm that critical biblical element.
Oh, yeah, very, very much so, yeah.
Yes.
And out of that, of course, comes a desire to share the faith with people, evangelism.
Yep.
And then finally, consummation, the second coming, maybe the recreation or restoration, as it's sometimes described. Is there an affirmation from both of you on that score?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All those things, yeah.
Oh, anything else you want to talk about in that context before we move to our discussion of the dating methods and things?
Well, I would just want to affirm that there is a very strong resonance, again, between what we are doing at Reasons to Believe and what is the work that's happening at the Discovery Institute. So I see us as being allies in the greater, in the greater mission, really, to engage our culture. And I think, there is enormous value in what the Discovery Institute is doing, because you can't even begin to talk about the gospel until people are convinced that there is a designer, or there is a creator, right? And because once that idea is in place, now the gospel makes sense. So, I know that the focus and the mission of the Discovery Institute is more secular oriented, but there are profound theological implications in what they're doing that really are proto-evangelistic.
Yeah, and I would also add that, when I'm talking, I'm speaking for myself right now, not from Discovery Institute as far as my belief in the Christian faith. I certainly have many colleagues at Discovery who I think would agree with the tenets that you have raised, Ken, and we would all, we're Christians. but there are some who would not. So it's just
Right.
a difference there. But yeah, as you said, Fuzz, there's definitely a very strong resonance between our two organizations on many of these design arguments. And at Discovery, we will work with a wide variety of folks out there with different, they may have slightly different missions, but if they think that there's, good evidence for design in nature, then of course we want to make common cause with those kinds of people. So we've appreciated, having you participate in a couple of our things over the years, and I feel very comfortable being here with you guys talking about this today. And as a Christian, I certainly do agree with what you said, Fuzz, that, somebody who is maybe coming from an atheistic perspective and sees these arguments for design, it really does often open people up to the possibility that there is a God who loves them and creates them. Of course, I try to make the case using science, and that's kind of what we do at Discovery. We're focused on building a scientific argument for design, but I agree that there can be larger implications to these scientific theories, and that's just the way that these issues work. There's larger implications to evolution as well, and these issues it's not, you can make a scientific argument, but that doesn't mean there's not larger issues at stake very, very often.
And Fuzz, would you agree that a lot of times our arguments are really philosophical arguments, but they're informed by science?
Yes, yeah, and it pains me to say that, Ken. No, but it's actually true, because at the end of the day, really, the cosmological argument, the design argument, even the argument from beauty, which I think science speaks to, are really philosophical, maybe even theological arguments that the science really helps to justify certain premises in the argument. So I very much agree with that. And even when you start thinking about, the nature of science today, where it's shaped by methodological naturalism, that's a philosophical framework that's being imposed on the scientific process. So that's even the critique of aspects of the evolutionary paradigm or the critique of materialism ultimately has a philosophical undergirding.
Now, Casey, another thing that you're involved with, you're an attorney. There is an involvement in defending religious liberty, a person's right. Maybe school teachers have a right to believe that there is a creator, there is intelligent design. Maybe you could speak to what does the Discovery Institute provide on that context?
Sure, and I would frame it more like freedom of inquiry, freedom of free speech.
Okay.
And certainly these freedoms are all interrelated. When you look at the First Amendment, you've got freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association. These are all freedoms that are bound together in our legal system that we have. But I think that intelligent design, when it comes up, is more along the lines of freedom of scientific inquiries, freedom of speech, freedom to think, and freedom to do research. And so, I wouldn't say that it's a huge part of what we do at Discovery, but we've been involved with many academic freedom cases and situations over the years, helping to provide people with assistance who are being persecuted or discriminated against because of their support for intelligent design or their dissent from Darwinian evolution. And I know that there are folks that we work with who have crossovers with you guys as well. And frankly, we've worked with a wide variety of folks of different backgrounds, coming from different places in the origins question, who are facing persecution. There was a documentary that came out a number of years ago called Expelled with Ben Stein.
Sure.
And that documentary told the stories of a number of scientists who faced persecution. And I worked on a number of the cases that were featured in that documentary, helping to provide some behind-the-scenes assistance with those folks. So unfortunately, it is a reality in this world that we live in today that people who don't sort of toe the Darwinian line or don't fit with the materialistic consensus view and are actually willing to be outspoken about it and maybe even, challenge it in a classroom, they are really sticking their necks out. And there's a real element of persecution and intolerance against people with those views today.
Let's touch on one more point. Today, among science, faith, apologetic organizations, you've got some who hold to a young earth. You've got others who hold to an old earth. There are others who distinguish themselves not only as just old earthers, but as evolutionary creationists. You're not speaking for the Discovery Institute, who has people from all of the sides of that. Where would you see yourself in terms of the age of the earth and whether God uses evolution?
Sure. So I personally am an old earther. Discovery Institute does not have an official position on the age of the Earth. We do have folks from a young Earth view that work with us. We have, I would actually say, though, that probably a pretty large majority of our fellows and staff are coming from more of an old Earth perspective, but it's not exclusive. It's not ubiquitous. We don't have an official position on that. But yeah, I personally am an old Earther. And to what extent does God use evolution? Well, this is a big question, but I think we have to define the term evolution in order to address that. Evolution can mean different things. If we just mean change over time, that there can be small-scale changes within a species, of course, everybody agrees that this happens. There are species that are alive on Earth today that were not alive in the past, and vice versa. So absolutely, life has changed over time. You can have small-scale changes within species. That is a form of evolution. Another way of looking at evolution is the idea of common ancestry, the idea that every living organism shares a common ancestor. If you go back far enough, not only are we related, but I'm related to my pet cat, I'm related to the fungus growing on the bottom of my foot, et cetera, et cetera. So universal common ancestry is, I think, a part of evolution where I would call myself a skeptic.
Okay.
I don't think that the scientific evidence supports universal common ancestry. When you look at the fossil evidence, the DNA evidence, we'll talk about this in more detail, I'm sure, and other lines of evidence, biogeography. But within Discovery Institute, again, we have diversity of views on that question. I do have colleagues who are more favorable towards common ancestry, common descent. And this reflects the fact that intelligent design as a science is really not, it's not necessarily questioning common descent. It's really getting at what I would call the third definition of evolution, which is the idea that the whole show of the history of life is the result of unguided, blind, and undirected natural mechanisms. And that's it, okay? And that is certainly where intelligent design would say, no, we think that there is scientifically detectable evidence for design in the history of life. You could have, some form of designed, guided common ancestry, or you could have some form of designed, and guidance in the history of life where you don't have common ancestry being true. I would be more in the latter camp, but there are some folks in the ID community who are more in the former camp. But we all agree that there is scientific evidence for design in the history of life. It was not just a whole show of, random mutation, blind natural selection. Certainly those are forces at work, and we would say they can do some things, but we would say that they can't do all things. They can't explain the entirety of the complexity of life. So there is a real spectrum of views in the ID community hearing that, but we all agree there's real scientific evidence for design in nature.
Fuzz?
A point that Casey made, I think is really, really worth emphasizing, and that's the idea that the evolutionary paradigm is deeply anti-teleological, right? And this is really what constitutes, as I understand it, the Darwinian revolution. It wasn't that Darwin suggested that, species could be explained through natural selection and later sexual selection, or that maybe that mechanism extrapolated over periods of time could explain the diversity of life on Earth. His real revolution constituted the idea that the appearance of design, that the exquisite adaptations that organisms display is coming from mechanism alone, that mechanism replaced any role for the mind. And so evolution is deeply anti-teleological. And so today, that is very much imprinted on evolutionary theory. So I think that really is the core issue that even at times I think we get a bit confused about here at Reasons to Believe, is recognizing that the core issue is responding to the anti-teleological nature. Because I think there are some versions of evolutionary theory that are emerging that are deeply teleological, like process structuralism. I think Michael Denton, who's connected with the Discovery Institute, favors that view, or Simon Conway Morris. There's some younger biochemists who are Christians, who are theists, that hold that view. Zachary Arden is somebody that comes to mind, Stephen Freeland, that are in this camp where they're saying, Ard Louis, that, gosh, there's something in this evolutionary process that seems to be, dictated, that the evolutionary outcomes are pre-sculpted. That's a very interesting idea that is not your grandfather's evolution. It's and in fact, people that espouse that view are soundly criticized within the evolutionary community because of the teleological nature of that process.
Wow.
So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. But everything that Casey said, I would echo with. Obviously, we're an old Earth organization, and we truly see, when we look at the fossil record, a history of life that appears to be superintended by a creator, by a mind. It's not an unguided, directionless process that we're looking at.
And both high view of Scripture, 2 books, the Book of Nature, the Book of Scripture.
Yes.
Sure, yeah. And if I could piggyback off something Fuzz just said, what you just highlighted, I think, Fuzz, is that even within the theistic evolution camp, there's a lot of diversity of views. You have some folks, I think Francis Collins probably, when he wrote in the language of God, that when we look at the history of life, it would appear to us to be a blind and undirected process. So he's sort of taking the standard, evolutionary paradigm and saying this is the way God did it. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, some folks who would call themselves theistic evolutionists, but what they really mean is that God guided evolution in some very detectable, meaningful way, and those folks may even be like in the intelligent design camp. And then there's some of the folks you just mentioned who are sort of coming up with these new interesting ways, and I'm not saying they all are in the exact same place, but they're sort of like teleological versions of evolution. To an extent, they might be friendly to ID, but to another extent, maybe not. And these are a lot of different views that are out there right now. It's very interesting, the spectrum of views.
Yeah, but to me, the problem I have with saying, well, it looks to us like evolution is random, unguided, undirected, but God is somehow working, in ways that are undetectable to us to produce an outcome that He desires. That doesn't square with me to Scripture, which says God is revealed through His creation. So I'm very sympathetic to somebody who would espouse some form of evolutionary creation, but says this is clearly a teleological process that's detectable. That is a very different position than the position that Francis Collins espouses, which is a very common position that I see among theistic evolutionists. So I think the point is that there is this place for rapprochement, for ID people, old Earth creationists, and some, evolutionary creationists that, again, see evolution as teleological.
I agree with you. For me, one of my favorite verses is Romans 1:20, where it says that Paul says that God is clearly seen in what has been made. Some versions of theistic evolution, God is not clearly seen. I mean, He's there, but you're not seeing Him clearly. I'm not fully sold that some of these teleological versions of evolution make God clearly seen yet. I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm willing to listen, and I think they're interesting, innovative ideas. Yeah,
and that would be my perspective. And it's worth talking about them or engaging those ideas. You're right.
And the people who promote them are often very sympathetic, so good people to dialogue with.
So we've got allies, we've got brothers in Christ. Let's begin looking at some of the particulars of the fossil record. Maybe we could begin with the dating methods. And so what are those dating methods, and are they reliable? Fuzz, maybe you could begin.
Yeah, well, I mean, we would take the position at Reasons to Believe that the dating methods are reliable. Every method in science is going to break down or fail from time to time. But by and large, you would say that the dating methods are producing reliable results. And something that I find deeply impressive, I'm not a geologist, but I have a background in chemistry, and the fundamental ideas behind dating, radiometric dating at least, is essentially first-order chemical kinetics. So, and there are nuclear transformations, but they still are, be understood as chemical transformations. So I'm very familiar with how radiometric dating works, at least, conceptually. But what is really impressive to me is that the oldest rocks on Earth date at about 3.8, 3.9, maybe 4 billion years in age, right? We have meteorites from Mars that date at 3.8 billion years in age. We have lunar rocks that are about 4.2 billion years in age. We have meteorites that are 4.5 billion years in age. And so we have all these samples from different parts of our solar system that are giving us a really consistent picture of the antiquity of the Earth, right? To have that many different samples that are from different sources in the solar system that are utilizing, different, specific radiometric techniques to give you that consistent picture, to me as a scientist, that is extremely impressive.
Okay. Casey, your thoughts about the reliability and what are some of these particular tests that are involved in the fossil record?
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree with Fuzz that it is interesting that we get consistency among the dating methods sometimes. And to me, that has been a good line of evidence that the dating methods, there is something real there, that they are reliable. I think for me, one of the strongest evidences for an ancient universe came actually from reading some of the material from RTB, and that was from the speed of light coming from very distant stars and supernovas. And that was a really influential on me for convincing me that the universe really is ancient, because you have these supernovas where we know from basically geometry essentially that they are in fact many millions of light years away. And if those were not real events that happened, then it sort of seems like, okay, is God deceiving us by creating light of this explosion in transit? It seems to me like it's a real event that really happened, and it happened many millions of years ago. And then consistency in radiometric dating, although there are also examples where radiometric dating gives you crazy results. I did some radiometric dating during my PhD in geology, and I got some crazy results, but that wasn't actually too surprising, because this dike that we were dating, it was just a really, really ugly piece of rock that had a tortured history, and it was not surprising that it gave really bad results. But there are examples where radiometric dating gives you very consistent results, and to me that shows that there is something real going on there. So what are some radiometric dating methods? Well, there's uranium to lead dating, which there's different methods, but the main one that's used, I think, has a half-life, uranium-238, of about 4.5 billion years. There's potassium-argon dating, where I believe that the half-life of potassium is about 1.3 billion years. There is strontium, neodymium. There is, now I'm digging back into my memory here.
Sure.
Of course, there's radiocarbon dating, where you have carbon-14 decaying into carbon-12, and the half-life there is only about 5,700 years, so you can only use it, for about 10 half-lives, dating things back to about 50 to 60,000 years. So you've got all these different methods, and they're useful in different, uranium thorium, that's the other one I was thinking of, yeah, which I think that's used more, I think the half-life there is about maybe 80,000 years, so it's used for more younger materials. So you've got all these different methods, and they're useful for different types of rocks, different circumstances, or in the case of radiocarbon dating, you would use that on things that are of an organic origin. So depending on what you're trying to date and how old you think it is, you'll try different methods and see what you get. Yeah.
Fuzz, I was talking with a prominent evolutionary creationist who said that human evolution is as sure as gravity. I had to blink when I heard that. What does the fossil record say about evolution?
Well, I mean, it is true that we see between, let's say, roughly 6 to 7 million years ago and the appearance of modern humans, an ensemble of, hominin fossils, right? And in fact, I think that's one of the most significant scientific achievements that we have seen in the last century, is the fact that we do have such a large, hominin fossil record, and many times evolutionary biologists or evolutionary creationists will point to the hominin fossil record and say, see, here are these transitional intermediates. But just as Casey said, the term evolution is ambiguous, and you have to know what you mean. I think the term transitional intermediate is ambiguous, because a lot of times what paleontologists mean when they say that there are these transitional forms, they mean that there are these forms between two time points that we are assuming are documenting an evolutionary change, versus a definition where the transitional forms would be A to B, B to C, C to D. So do we have transitional forms? Yes, between two time points. Do we see a clear documentation of the pathway that goes from something like a pre-Australopithecine to modern humans? I would argue no, that we don't have a very clear pathway, and this Bronsky ascent of man imagery that we're all familiar with really is not valid at all, because the hominins that we would traditionally ascribe to that evolutionary sequence are generally rendered side branches and dead ends. And there's a lot of question marks as to, who would these different ancestral species be?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. There's sort of different ways of defining a transitional form. And the soft definition is, okay, well, it has some features that might appear intermediate between, group A and group B. We don't necessarily mean that it was an actual transitional form, that it actually, or it even could have been a transitional form, but it just has some features that look somewhat intermediate. And then there's more of the hard definition where it actually was, or at least could have been, an actual intermediate between group A and group B. And those hard transitional forms are a lot harder to find than the soft transitional forms. But even then, these things are often few and far between. There's a great quote from a major review of hominid fossils from a 2015 book by Springer Verlag titled Macroevolution. And the chapter was by Bernard Wood and Grabowski. It was a very nice chapter. But here's what they said. They said, the evolutionary sequence for the majority of hominin lineages is unknown. Most hominin taxa, particularly early hominins, have no obvious ancestors, and in most cases, ancestor-descendant sequences, fossil time series, cannot be reliably constructed. So to me, that's very interesting. I mean, it's not that there are no examples of possible ancestor-descendant sequences, but certainly they are not as common as we're often led to believe.
So this was, you said Bernard Wood, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a very interesting paper published in the early 2000s by Bernard Wood and Mark Collard, who were basically arguing that the cranial dental features are not reliable to build phylogenetic trees. And that's primarily the data you have when you look at the hominin fossil record. And so they're making the case, that intrinsically the hominin fossil record is just simply, the evolutionary relationships are inaccessible to us given the data that we have. And I think they ended up arguing in the paper that it was some kind of weird microanatomical feature in the forearm that was phylogenetically diagnostic or something like that. I don't remember the specifics, but it's interesting that he's still continuing with that argument 15 years later.
Yeah, they would say there's a lot of homoplasia and convergence when you look at craniodental features. So it's not telling you a lot of useful phylogenetic information. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, something else that I think is also intriguing to me is the fact that, one of the defining features of modern humans is our ability to stand and walk erect, our bipedalism. And, the traditional evolutionary view that I, saw in textbooks when I was a college student, and was, there was this climactic change that took place where the forests of East Africa were replaced by an open savanna, and that created this enormous evolutionary driving force to lead to these quadruped ape-like creatures to stand erect and to begin to move with bipedal capabilities, right? And so the idea would be you could see predators at a greater distance in an open savanna if you were erect. There were thermal regulatory advantages. You could travel longer distances to gather food, if your arms were free, these types of things. But when you look at what is required to go from a knuckle-walking quadruped to a biped, it's literally an entire rearrangement of the skeleton and musculature, even including rearrangement of bones in the inner ear. And this all has to happen in a highly coordinated manner. And yet when we look at the hominin fossil record, the earliest hominins look as if they had bipedal capabilities. And there's a debate whether it was facultative or obligatory bipedalism, but bipedalism shows up. There's no transitional sequence or transitional process for the emergence of bipedalism. It's just there when hominins appear.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the early hominins, they do have this similar problem where we don't have a lot of data. I mean, I'm thinking of Auroran tugenensis. Yes, we have part of a femur, but that's pretty much all we've got. Even Ardipithecus ramidus was in such poor condition. You know, there was a paper by Bernard Wood actually in Nature about Artie, which said that all of the characters that we're using to say that it was a biped could also possibly qualify it as a quadruped. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to know sometimes because the data is just not clear, but I agree with you. I mean, I do think that the Australopithecines, for example, were capable of some very significant degree of upright walking. It was different from that of modern humans. They had a bicondylar angle, which was much greater than human beings, and I think it's a different form of bipedalism. They also seem to be well adapted for climbing in trees and had some features of knuckle walkers. So it's different, but still, you're right. I mean, you get something very different all of a sudden, and it does not evolve gradually. We don't see that.
And the paleoclimatic data seems to indicate, and the paleoecological data is what I meant to say, also seems to indicate that these hominins were either in a woodland environment where there's no evolutionary driving force, or a mixed woodland open savanna, which means now that the ability to knuckle walk for arboreal locomotion, for bipedalism, makes sense in that kind of a mixed environment. They were well designed to operate in the ecological system they found themselves.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. But that old story that, the savanna was drying out and they came down out of the trees, that has sort of lost favor because they're finding these fossils in woodland environments. It's not a dry environment, and yet they seem to have some degree of upright walking ability. Yeah.
Well, Fuzz, I've heard you say that during Darwin's time, there were people who believed in common design rather than common descent. Is that dead today? Is it still?
Yeah. Well, I mean that idea is indeed dead in mainstream, evolutionary biology, mainstream biology. But I think there's a very strong case that can be made for common design today. And I think, both Casey and I would look at the hominin fossil record in very similar terms, that this is reflecting a sequence of designed organisms. And maybe there was microevolutionary processes that created some diversification. But I see like the Australopithecines, maybe the Habilines, the Erectines, archaic Homo sapiens as being distinct forms that God created that then experienced diversification. But that idea traces back to thinkers like Louis Agassiz, who saw the hominin fossil record, in those terms. Or the idea of common design is an idea that, traces back to Sir Richard Owen, really, who I think made the most powerful elaboration of that idea. So in other words, in the history of biology, the views that Casey and I broadly share about common design and about the nature of the hominin fossil record, those ideas are not ad hoc inventions of a modern time in response to Darwinism. These are ideas that were instantiated in the history of biology and were supplanted, by Darwin's ideas. So yes, they've fallen out of favor, but I don't think it's because of evidential reasons. I think it's because, again, these are teleological ideas that have no place in biology today.
Great point, Fuzz. We need to bring common design back. I think it has a very strong tradition in biology. I agree with you 100% there, yeah. And I think that it also shows that, look, there's many cases where common ancestry is a possible explanation for why two species share a similar trait, and that may be the answer. But if that's the only possible answer we're looking at, then I don't think that's the best way to do science. We need to let common design also be a possibility. And because there are some cases where I think, you see extreme examples of convergent evolution, right? I mean, think of echolocation in bats and whales, right? Where those are the two mammal groups that are engaged in echolocation. They're very far removed on the mammalian tree, according to an evolutionary view, and yet they have these very similar traits, not just morphologically and behaviorally, but even at the genetic level to allow them to do this. Well, could that be an example where common design would be a much better explanation than, your standard evolutionary convergence type explanation? So I agree with you 100%, yeah.
Yeah, well, when I look at the hominin fossil record, I do see these discontinuities, and maybe Casey would agree, maybe he would disagree, but there does seem to be a very large discontinuity between the Australopithecines and the Homo genus, right? And even within Homo, you see like the habilines, and then when the erectines appear, there is a very different body plan almost. And particularly in terms of behavioral capacity, there's this sudden step change. And then you see, in a sense, stasis. And then there are the archaic, Homo sapiens. And then there's, I would argue that when modern humans appear, there's another very significant step change in terms of behavioral capacities. So it's not this gradual emergence of features, but it really feels like a discontinuity that to me seems like it's best explained by design. And we might argue, hey, which groups actually are discontinuous and which groups should be combined. But I think there's that discontinuity and those core designs that you see as you step through life's history.
Yeah, that is a really significant point. There is a major discontinuity. I think Ernst Mayr called it a large unbridged gap between the ape-like Australopithecines, which are supposed to be directly ancestral to the genus Homo, and the earliest human-like members of the genus Homo, like Homo erectus. I think habilis is kind of an interesting character. Some people don't even think habilis is a real taxon. I have no problem with it being a real taxon, but we were talking about Wood and Collar. They had a great paper in the journal Science, and then another paper actually a few years later, which classified habilis as a member of Australopithecus. They found that basically all of its body traits were more Australopithecine than belonging in the genus Homo. But in any case, we have a distinct break between the ape-like Australopithecines and the human-like members of the genus Homo, and that is really when the human-like body plan appears in the hominid fossil record, and we don't have fossils documenting that crucial evolutionary transition. So I do think this is a real problem for evolutionary models, and I would agree with you 100%. It looks like a good example of design. So and this raises the question, how do we infer design, an instance of design in the fossil record? I can give you my take. I don't know, Fuzz, you may or may not think the same way, but what does it take to build a new body plan? It takes new genes, it takes new genetic information, it takes new DNA and code essentially. And where does information and code come from? Well, it comes in our experience from a mind. So when we see a radical new body plan or group of body plans appearing in the fossil record, what that really is reflecting is an infusion of new information that's been rapidly imported into the biosphere. And that is then expressed as the abrupt appearance of new types of organisms. So because this is really abrupt appearance, explosions of new types of organisms really is an example of new information showing up in the natural world very rapidly. And information, especially, large amounts of new information comes from a mind. And this also comes to the idea of blueprints. What do intelligent agents do when we design things? Well, we form a blueprint. We build the structure, and then we release it into the world to do whatever it is it's going to do. We don't build it halfway. We don't build it part way, and then before we put it out there into the market to sell it, we make it so it's fully formed and ready to go. And we see that also reflected in the fossil record. So I just think we see this pattern of abrupt appearance of fully formed organisms reflecting new information, and that makes a good argument for design. And we see this through many different explosions in the history of life.
Well, to build up upon the very powerful point Casey made, when you look at the history of life, every time there are these major innovations, they always seem to happen explosively without any kind of intermediary grades documenting that transition. And so Eugene Koonin referred to this as biology's big bangs, right, in this classic article. And he was looking at this from a genomic standpoint, where he would argue that when you look at the history of life from a genomic standpoint, there seems to be these abrupt transitions. And I can't remember the ones that he identified, but clearly you see it at the origin of life, right? Where you have the sudden appearance of cells on the earth as soon as the earth can reasonably support life. And these are inherently complex, life forms, even though they're microbial. The eukaryotic Big Bang, where you now have a completely new cell type. Again, it happens abruptly. or when you look at the origin of body plans, you might even argue at the origin of consciousness. I think the origin of human exceptionalism. But the key point is that these are places where there are these abrupt transitions that seem to me to be a signature for creation because they are associated with innovation. And to Casey's really good point, there's a huge amount of information that's being infused into the system at these transitions. That to me is a signature for design, and you see it in the hominin fossil record, but I think you see it with respect to the totality of the history of life.
I don't know which Koonin quote you're thinking of. He has so many interesting quotes but here's one, and maybe this will fit the moment. Just may not be the one you're thinking of, but he said it was a 2007 paper in Biology Direct. Major transitions in biological evolution show the same pattern of sudden emergence of diverse forms at a new level of complexity. The relationships between major groups within an emergent new class of biological entities are hard to decipher and do not seem to fit the tree pattern that, following Darwin's original proposal, remains the dominant description of biological evolution. So, very nice quote from Koonin there.
Yeah, and that paper I think is the paper I'm thinking about. So yeah, it's quite appropriate, Casey. Thanks.
Let's talk a little bit about Neanderthals. Fuzz, we had a workshop last year where we talked about human exceptionalism. What is the relationship to human beings to Neanderthals? What is at stake there on the issue of humans and Neanderthals?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that the question of who were the Neanderthals is really a linchpin question that impacts, whether or not the RTB model is valid, whether Bill Craig's model is valid, whether the model of Van Gager or even young Earth models, because those different models have very different views of who Neanderthals are. So it is a linchpin question that at least is critical in discerning which of the different Christian models may actually have the greatest validity. And at RTB we take the view that Neanderthals were creatures with intelligence, emotional capacity, but they lacked the image of God, and therefore that's going to be reflected in their behavioral capacities, and that in turn is going to be reflected in the archaeological record. And I think it's safe to say from the archaeological record that there is a dispute as to what Neanderthals' cognitive capacities were. Were they like ours, or were they not like ours? Were they inferior? That's disputed. But I would argue that what breaks the dispute is that we do see differences in the brain structure between humans and Neanderthals that suggest humans had cognitive superiority and hence would make sense that they would bear God's image. But we also are seeing getting information now from comparative genomics. We know that there's a number of genes that are different in the human and Neanderthal genomes, and many of those genes are involved in playing a big role in neural development, in cognition, or have been implicated in neuropsychiatric disorders. And we now have work where people are creating brain organoids. These are three-dimensional cell cultures from human-induced pluripotent stem cells. And then they can actually Neanderthalize select genes in those cells to make brain cultures that have a Neanderthal version of a particular gene of interest. And in those cases where those are genes that, again, are implicated in neural development, cognition, there are differences in the Neanderthal and modern human brain organoids where the brain organoids seem to have lower neuronal density, and the quality of the neurons are not as great for the Neanderthalized version versus the modern human version. So that would be the evidence that I would argue supports, the RTB position.
So there are other positions that Neanderthals were essentially human? Do people take that view?
Yeah, so I'll tell my story here a little bit, if that's okay. I think 10 years ago, if you had asked me the question, were Neanderthals essentially human, I would have said absolutely, unquestionably yes, all right? And then I met a woman who you guys were very good friends with until her passing away, Sue Dykes, who was a PhD paleoanthropologist and a wonderful lady, just very, very gifted intellectually and just a wonderful person. And I would bring to Sue all these arguments. We see burial of the dead. We see evidence of high culture, tool use, music, human Neanderthal interbreeding, et cetera, that shows that we're all the same species. And Sue would always have a rejoinder to me, okay? So Sue kind of softened me up a little bit towards the RTB view. I'm not going to lie. She kind of moved me a little bit in your direction. So I would say that right now, I could go either way. I think that probably 3 days of the week, I do believe that Neanderthals were, in fact, fully human. We're us and they are them, et cetera, or they're us and we are them. I would say that we're all part of the same species. But I'm also open to the idea that maybe they were created separately from human beings, and that, something more along the lines of the RTB view. If that turns out to be right, I'm not going to lose any sleep, and I don't think it's a crazy view. I think it's a very reasonable view. So I don't know exactly where it's all going to land, but we talked about this earlier away from the microphone, that what's interesting is that actually mainstream scientists are debating this same question. It's not like it is just people in the Christian community who are trying to figure out where do Neanderthals fit in. Even mainstream scientists disagree on whether or not they were fully human or a totally separate species, and interbreeding, was it common, was it rare, was it normal, was it, did it happen at all? These are all questions that are being debated. So I think this is sort of a question that is underdetermined by the data right now, and it's going to take time to sort this out. I'm very comfortable to follow the evidence wherever it leads on these questions, but again, I do lean towards them being fully human. But if that turns out to be wrong, I'm going to be just fine.
Well, I think it's interesting because this is a point that our friend Josh Swamidas made to me, is that he goes, do you realize that your model and Bill Craig's model are very similar? He goes, and the only difference is the identity of Neanderthals. And if we took Bill Craig's view of Neanderthals, our model would essentially revert to his. And if he took our view, his model would revert to ours, or very close, right? And I think that's probably even true with the model that Ann Gager, advocates. So the good news is that this has been a very critical, question that really distinguishes models. But once you resolve that question, there are several models that Christians are proposing for, human origins that really collapse into a single model. That to me is really encouraging.
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday. I think that within the Christian community, there are a variety of viable models that can explain the data, and it's not a problem of having no model that's going to work. I think it's just a question of which one is going to turn out to be the right one. So that's the way, as a Christian who's trying to make sense of these things, that's the way I see it.
I have another question about Neanderthals, but I want to remind our listeners, you can ask your question. We're going to take your questions in just a few minutes. You need to put them in the chat box. They'll be relayed to me, and then we'll ask our guests. Let me ask another question about Neanderthals, and that is there evidence that Neanderthals were in humanity's genealogy?
Well, I mean, the evolutionary model would argue that humans and Neanderthals are separate evolutionary branches. So I don't think anybody today would say that Neanderthals gave rise to modern humans.
Okay.
At one time, the argument was that at least in Europe, Neanderthals were the direct, ancestors to the Europeans, to modern Europeans. That was part of the idea of multi-regionalism. So nobody thinks that to be the case. So they are understood as being separate branches, and there is a debate as to what was the hominin that was the ancestral species. Was it Homo heidelbergensis? Was it Homo antecessor? Was it maybe a late appearing Homo erectus? These are all ideas that are debated, but some evolutionary biologists debate whether Neanderthals and modern humans were the same species that are just now that are part of groups that just had not completely finished diverging into separate species. Others argue that they were separate species. We would take the view that they were not obviously our ancestors and that they were indeed distinct species from us.
But Fuzz, you would say that there may have been some interbreeding there, although
yes.
It was probably not necessarily what God's plan was, and plenty of things that happened in human history that were not, what God's
yes.
direct will for us. So,
sure. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, without question, I don't like it, but yes, indeed, the evidence for interbreeding is very strong, I think. in attempts that I've seen people make to try to sidestep the interbreeding problem or to make the claim that there wasn't interbreeding, don't account for the totality of the data, in my mind. They make some interesting arguments, but they don't account for the totality of the data.
Let me ask a question before we begin entertaining some questions. What is the import for this topic in terms of communicating our faith to other people? Where does this come down in terms of moving from the Christian perspective to a non-Christian?
Well, I mean, at Discovery Institute, as we said, we're not evangelistic, but I am personally a Christian, and so I'm interested in seeing people, not move towards atheism, and I think it's important to show that there is evidence for design in the history of life. And so, I mean, if I could just sound off really quick on something, actually,
Sure.
We were talking about all these different explosions. There's a great chapter in the volume Theistic Evolution by Stephen Meyer and Gunter Beckley, where it's titled The Fossil Record in Universal Common Ancestry. And they go through 19 different explosions in the history of life. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I would just want to mention a few of them really quick, because I think this really shows that there has been design throughout the history of life, and that an unguided, undirected evolutionary history of life really does not explain the data very well. So we have the Avalon explosion at about 575 to 565 million years ago, where you get these strange sessile organisms with glide symmetry, and they kind of appear and disappear, but there's not an evolutionary, build up to them. They just appear and then they disappear. Then, of course, there's the Cambrian explosion about 520 to 530 million years ago, where we see somewhere around 21 different animal phyla that appear abruptly without any direct evolutionary precursors. This is the most dramatic example, but then there's later examples. So we have the Great Ordovician biodiversification event from about 497 to 467 million years ago, an explosion of marine invertebrates. We're talking about brachiopods, bivalves, gastropods, many diverse forms appear. There's a Silurian fish explosion of jawed and jawless fishes. There's the Devonian nekton revolution. Nekton are swimming organisms that can propel themselves through water, and we're talking about things like coiled nautiloids and the ammonoids and cephalopods and cartilaginous and bony jawed fishes that appear abruptly. In the Silurian and Devonian, there's a plant explosion. We're not flowering plants, but just many different diverse types of plants. Then in the Cretaceous, there is what we call the angiosperm explosion, or the big bloom, where many types of flowering plants appear. In the late Cretaceous and early Tertiary, there's an explosion of major types of birds. In the early Tertiary, we have an explosion of the various orders of mammals. And then, of course, we've been talking about this abrupt appearance of the genus Homo. So, you want to give another one, the origin of life. We now have, it's thought that the late heavy bombardment period may have ended at, 3.8 billion years ago. And by 3.77 billion years ago, we have pretty good fossil evidence of potentially even photosynthetic organisms, bacteria. So, we have an abrupt appearance even of life itself on Earth. So we have all these examples of explosions throughout the history of life. What we see in the history of life, I think, is basically evidence of design of different types of organisms at various stages. And I don't think that an unguided evolutionary mechanism or history fits the pattern that we see. So from my perspective as a Christian, this is very consistent with God making himself clearly seen in nature throughout the history of life. And I think that certainly as a Christian, I would say a Christian belief in some kind of a theistic worldview, a God who is actively involved in the world makes a lot more sense of the data than a deistic worldview or an atheistic worldview. That's what I would say. So, yeah.
How would the standard model respond to these explosions?
I think that most, paleontologists would acknowledge that these explosions do indeed happen. And if you talk to an evolutionary biologist that isn't well versed in a particular transition, oftentimes they're somewhat dismissive. But when you actually read the literature of people that are immersed in trying to understand that transition, they are very clear that they have no real understanding of what's going on. I mean, the example that I become very interested in is the origin of eukaryotic cells. And there's an evolutionary model called the endosymbiont hypothesis for this. And most people will say, look, that model is so well evidenced. But then when you start looking at the details of what would have to happen to go for a eukaryotic cell to emerge through that mechanism, the problems become legion very quickly at a biochemical level. And so when you read the literature for people that are working on that transition, they are very clear that we don't really know what's going on here. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of hand waving when you start talking about what would have had to happen at a biochemical level. So, it depends on who you ask, really, and what their familiarity is with a particular transition.
Let's go ahead
because I agree with you, Faz, 100%. A lot of mainstream, all these examples of explosions in the history of life, that was taken from the mainstream literature. This was not creationists or ID people making this up. This is from the mainstream view. I also need to correct something I said earlier. I said that the half-life of the uranium to thorium decay pathway was 80,000 years. It's actually, that didn't seem right, and I'm, again, digging back into my recesses of my mind. It's 245,000 years is the half-life there. For whatever it's worth, just want to correct that.
Let's take some questions from our chat. Again, you can get in the chat box and ask your question to Casey and Fuzz. Bill has a question. I think he intends it for both of you. Have your views on the fossil record changed at all since finishing your PhDs? If so, how?
Well, when I finished my PhD, I was a newly minted Christian and really had no true conception of what the fossil record looked like, other than some general understandings. It really wasn't until a number of years later that I began to actually look at details. And believe it or not, what triggered my study of the fossil record in more depth was an article that was written for a volume called The Creation Hypothesis, edited, I think, by J.P. Moreland. This was a book published years and years ago.
Yeah.
And it was an article by Kurt Wise, a young Earth creationist. And it's like, wow. When I read what he was writing, I thought, this is very different than what I understood. And so I began to dig into it and realized, wow, the patterns that you see in the fossil record are not what I had the impression that they were, and so that's how I changed my perspective on the fossil record.
Casey, how about you?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. My PhD was in geology, but although I did TA some courses that taught some paleontology to students during my PhD, my research was not on paleontology. I studied the early plate tectonic history of South Africa using paleomagnetism. So I'm not going to say that, I was studying fossils in my PhD. But that being said, I did my PhD in South Africa at the University of Johannesburg. And while I was living there for those about 4.5 years, I had quite a few opportunities to actually go to hominid fossil sites. And I learned a ton about hominid fossils, and even had an opportunity once to go and sample, help assist with sampling with a team that was going to the cradle of humankind. And it was really fun to go and do that. We took some paleomagnetic samples, and I got to see the cradle, up close and personal. So I had a lot of opportunities. So I would certainly say that studying hominid fossils and paleoanthropology on my own, and also just reading many papers about the larger fossil record, both before, during, and after my PhD, has affirmed my conviction that there is this pattern of explosions in the history of life that does not fit well with I would say, an unguided evolutionary approach. And I think it's much more consistent with design. And so I would certainly say that my PhD studies, although it wasn't directly on paleontology, what I learned in those years affirmed what I have said today. Yeah.
Question from Robert. When scientists transfer some Neanderthal genes into a prototype brain organelle, how do scientists compensate for gene splicing?
What they are doing is, in effect, using CRISPR gene editing techniques in the induced pluripotent stem cells to convert the human version to the Neanderthal version. And then at that point, it's that gene has been incorporated into the genome, and so they don't need to worry about splicing, because if that gene has introns and extrons, introns and exons, it's going to be spliced by the cell's machinery. So there's no need to worry about that.
Okay. Casey,
No,
comment?
great. That's fine.
Arella asked the question, what is the most current science about who the Denisovians were and beliefs about whether they were human?
The Denisovans, I believe, is the name. And
Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Fuzz, but I think we only have a very limited number of bones from Denisovans, and we have been able to get some DNA from those bones, like a
it might
finger,
be
right?
a fingertip, and
Yeah.
there might be a molar.
Yeah,
That's all we
yeah.
have.
So it's basically genetic evidence, and they're pretty similar to modern humans, but there are some differences there that let us know that this may have been I would predict it probably was like a subpopulation of the human species that had some genetic differences, but that's about all we know. I mean, we don't know a whole lot more than that. And I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah,
Fuzz.
well, I mean, the standard evolutionary view today would be that you have a common ancestor between humans and Neanderthals. Again, nobody knows what that would be. There's the modern human branch, then there's the branch that led to Neanderthals, but the Denisovans or Denisovans are a side branch off of the Neanderthal branch. And their distribution isn't really well understood, but we're seeing Denisovan DNA showing up in modern humans as well, and also Denisovan DNA that shows up in Neanderthals. So the thought is there was all this interbreeding going on between the three different groups. But yeah, there's speculation as, for example, there was the discovery of the Red Deer cave people in China, some speculation that these might be Denisovans, but you have to sample DNA now in order to be able to draw that conclusion.
And I read something recently, often it's said that Europeans have a lot of Neanderthal DNA, but I think that Denisovan DNA often appears in Pacific Islanders.
Yes.
And folks that live in the South Pacific, yeah.
Yeah. So the model is approximately modern humans are leaving Africa going into Europe. There's interbreeding that happens on a probably limited interbreeding, but happens multiple times with humans and Neanderthals. And then when humans encountered the Denisovans, there's interbreeding there. So like in the oceanic people groups, there's very high levels of Denisovan DNA relative to other people groups. But there is some in Europeans.
Question from Dan. Isn't the methodological naturalism of science a powerful means of keeping religious bias out of its conclusions? You both seem to want science to support your evangelism. Seems wrong.
I want to follow the evidence where it leads. That's the number one thing that we should all want, all right? More than I want anything else in science, I want to follow the evidence where it leads. And so look, what does methodological naturalism say? Methodological naturalism says that science needs to be, first of all, repeatable and testable and reliable. Well, I can make a repeatable, testable, and reliable argument for intelligent design. So when I'm arguing for design, that in no way, in my view, conflicts with sort of the spirit behind methodological naturalism. How does intelligent design work? Intelligent design uses the scientific method to make its claims. It starts with observations. We can observe intelligent agents and see that when they act, they generate high levels of information. We often call it complex and specified information. Then we can make a testable prediction, the next step in the scientific method. Make a prediction, make a hypothesis, that if a structure was designed, it will contain high levels of complex and specified information. We can then test that hypothesis. For example, Douglas Axe and various scientists have done research to look for high levels of complex and specified information in biological systems. You can do mutational sensitivity tests on proteins. You can do genetic knockout experiments on molecular machines and find that they have to have a very specific set of parts or a very specific nucleotide sequence in order for them to work. And this is basically, essentially, this is finding high levels of complex and specified information in biology. So we conclude that when we find this, we call it CSI, by the way, for short, when we find these high CSI systems, that is good evidence for design. In our experience, high levels of complex and specified information only come from design. Okay, so I've just made an argument using the scientific method, using observation, hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion to make a case for design. I didn't do anything there that was unscientific, okay? I didn't violate the spirit of the scientific method. I don't even think that a methodological naturalist ought to have a problem with what I just said, other than imposing the arbitrary requirement that you're never allowed to use the scientific method to infer a mind was at work, okay? But I just used the scientific method to infer that a mind was at work. So if we then come up, if all that methodological naturalism means is that we're disallowed from using the very scientific method that is yielded all this fruit for humanity, we can do anything we want with it except for inferring that a mind was at work, I consider that to be an arbitrary rule that's being imposed upon science. And that is where I think actually if that's what methodological naturalism is, then that is where methodological naturalism is standing in the way of following the evidence where it leads and doing good science. So I have no problem with jettisoning methodological naturalism if it's going against the scientific method. I'm going to use the scientific method. If it leads me to material causes, great. If it leads me to intelligent causes, also great. I want to follow the evidence where it leads. This is not about, imposing my Christian bias. I mean, I could say the same thing about atheists if we want to play this game, that they want to use methodological naturalism to exclude the possibility that there's any mind or designer or supernatural God. If you want to play affirming your bias game, we could play that game on atheists probably even more so than they play it against us, all right? So fine, let's just not play the game. Let's just follow the evidence where it leads, and let's get rid of these arbitrary restrictions that interfere with doing good science.
I think that was an exceptional answer, Casey, and I would agree with it 100%. And I would point out that I'm not a Christian looking to use science to support my beliefs. I am a Christian because science pushed me in that direction. I was an agnostic when I started graduate school, and it was the design of biochemical systems that convinced me there had to be a mind behind everything. And it was more an intuition rather than a robust scientific conclusion, but it was the evidence that led me to conclude there was a creator, and that then ultimately led to my conversion to Christianity. So I'm not looking as a person of faith for evidence to support my view. That evidence was in place before I became a Christian. And I would build off of Casey's excellent response. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there are areas of science that employ quote-unquote methodological naturalism that actually detect the work of intelligent agency in nature. This is SETI, the archaeology, crime scene investigation. These are all areas that are employing a scientific method in drawing conclusions that intelligent agency is at work. And so I've actually looked at, for example, work of archaeologists and said, what is the criteria they are using to draw their conclusion? And then take that criteria and apply it to biochemistry, and you wind up with the same conclusion utilizing that criteria. But in the case of the archaeological record, that conclusion stands because people are seeing that intelligent agency as being naturalistic, whereas in biochemistry, it clearly is not a naturalistic intelligent agency, but it's the same quality of evidence, the same type of evidence, same caliber of evidence, that points to agency. It's just that now that agency must be something beyond beyond at least human capabilities, and yet that conclusion is disallowed for an arbitrary reason, as Casey's pointing out.
If I could
jump in,
piggyback one more thing. Great, agree with everything you just said, Fuzz. I think that intelligent design, one of the reasons I like a design-based approach to doing science is it actually is a more open-minded way of doing science, and it has more explanatory tools in our toolkit. Because intelligent design never says that natural causes can't be the answer, right? If the best evidence leads us to a material, natural mechanism, fine. Intelligent design has zero problems with that whatsoever. What intelligent design says is that why is it that in every single case that blind mechanism has to always be the answer? Maybe in some cases the best explanation is a mind and not just a blind natural mechanism. So intelligent design is actually expanding our explanatory toolkit. But as a Christian, if I use the scientific method and I come up with some natural law, natural mechanism as an explanation, does that bother me one bit? Of course not. I mean, no, not zero whatsoever does that bother me. But what It does, however, bother, I think, the atheist when they are looking at people using the scientific method and they reach the conclusion of a mind. So I think that it's important to understand that really a design-based paradigm for doing science, I think, really opens us up more to being able to follow the evidence where it leads and do better science without these restrictions. So anyway, just repeating what we already said.
We're building off of each other here, but this will be my last point. Then I'll be quiet. But to reiterate what Casey is saying, a creation model design approach is not only that gives you the greatest number of possible options, it ensures that science is actually being in service to discover the truth about the world. Whereas a methodological naturalistic approach is now playing a game where all you're doing is looking for a natural process explanation, whether one exists or not. And so you're not really discovering truth. You're playing a game according to a very restricted set of rules that very well may keep you from actually discovering what is true about the world. I mean, if the origin of life is truly the work of a creator, wouldn't we want to know that regardless of our worldview, right? That's real knowledge and real understanding about the world.
Now, Dan has a follow-up. He says, when you say design, how do you test that hypothesis?
I already answered that question.
Yeah.
You start by making observations about how intelligent agents operate in the world around us. The way we start with any scientific historical science, you start by observing the cause that you are thinking of invoking to explain the historical record, and you see what its capabilities are. And when we observe it, we can observe intelligent agents and see what their capabilities are. That point right there needs to be appreciated. The fact that we can observe intelligent agents and understand their capabilities is what makes intelligent design a legitimate science. Full stop.
Yeah.
Let's just ponder that. Full stop, okay? The fact that we can observe intelligent agents and understand what they were capable of doing and producing is what makes intelligent design a legitimate testable science, because we can observe intelligent agents, we can see that they produce high levels of complex specified information. We then have a variety of methods of testing for complex specified information in the natural world around us. Could be mutational sensitivity tests of proteins, could be genetic knockout experiments on molecular machines. There's other ways as well. Those are just two examples. But we can then test for high CSI. And when we find high CSI, in our experience, that only comes from intelligence, and therefore it is best explained by design. Now, don't get me wrong. It's a great question Dan is asking, and it's a very, very important question. I'm not knocking Dan for asking the question. It's a crucially important question. It's one, though, that I think has a very good answer, and it shows that ID is a legitimate science.
Well, it's interesting to me because I've pondered this question a lot, but even, groups like SETI will talk about concepts like artificiality, right? And when you press into what they mean something very similar to what, ID proponents and creationists mean when they use that term artificiality. And, I like Casey's point that we can observe what human designers do, and from that draw, kind of generalizations. And so it's interesting to me that, for example, you had William Paley talk about this idea of contrivances, or, Michael Behe, irreducible complexity, Bill Dembski, specified complexity, right? Doug Axe, I think, was functional coherence. Marcus Eblin was it foresight, or I can't remember his concept.
Yeah.
In my book, The Cells Design, I talk about an intelligent design pattern. These are all ideas that are basically strongly overlapping with each other. So in other words, you have independent people that are asking this question, that are coming up with a coherent, approach to identifying design. But it's predicated on what is it that designers do, and there's certain qualities that design systems have, and you can then quantitatively look at what you see in nature and determine, is this matching what a designer would do.
The way Stephen Meyer, I love what you just said, Fuzz. The way Stephen Meyer sometimes frames it, he will say that there are many roads to Rome. But I think that all these roads are using a very similar principle of we are trying to understand what intelligent agents do, and then using that understanding to help us detect design in nature. And there's various ways of doing that. But I love the answer you gave.
Question from Tim. The Sapiens book suggests our species got smarter, a cognitive revolution some 70,000 years ago. Is there support for that? And what are your views of it?
Yeah, well, I would argue that there does appear to be this cognitive revolution when modern humans appear on the scene. I would probably place that closer to 130,000 years ago as opposed to 70. But very clearly, in the archaeological record, 70,000 years appears to be that point where we see the emergence of symbolism unequivocally. And I think there is some inferences that we can draw from the fossil record, the archaeological record, that suggests that capacity for symbolism may even go back much earlier. So I think the answer to that question is yes. And that to me is part of the argument for human exceptionalism.
Yeah, Fuzz, I agree 100%. The archaeological revolution we see in the fossil record at about 100,000-ish years ago is very interesting, and I think that could be another example of design and the history of humanity. But what's interesting, I wrote a review of Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens* on the Discovery Institute website. You can go and find it there. Here's a quote from what he says. He says, "The appearance of new ways of thinking and communicating between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago constitutes the cognitive revolution. What caused it? We're not sure." So that's what Yuval Noah Harari actually says in his book, that he says that there was some mutations, accidental mutations, he says, caused a rewiring of the human brain to cause this cognitive revolution. Okay, fine. But he has no idea what it was. But he's sure that it was accidental mutations, okay? Yeah. But he has no idea what it actually was. I would argue that, when we look at the appearance of the human mind, and this abrupt appearance of human intellectual capacity, again, we're seeing information that had to be imported into the biosphere to explain this. And there's a great paper in the journal Genetics a number of years ago that said that in a population of humans, if you had a trait that required 2 or more mutations to be present before it gave you some advantage, that it would take over 100 million years to appear under normal, standard, blind evolutionary processes. So I think when we talk about the appearance of the human mind, whatever caused it, did not happen by blind evolutionary mechanisms.
A number of years ago, I was at a conference funded by Templeton. It was called Becoming Human in a Theistic Context. And I was the sole old Earth creationist there. A number of people that were evolutionary creationists in the room. And then there was Ian Tattersall, who's an atheist. And his specialization is studying the modern human emergence, that transition that led to modern humans. And I can remember him giving a presentation where he said, when modern humans show up, there is suddenly, out of nowhere, this capacity that shows up. It's like a ghost in the machine, and I don't know what happened. Oh. Right? And it's very similar to what Harari is saying there. So I've seen a number of anthropologists, talk about that. And, this is something that I think really distinguishes humans from Neanderthals. And that is, and Casey may or may not agree with this, but right? There may have been some very small progression towards the end of their time here, but it's largely static. Modern humans show up on the scene beginning with primitive technology that I think was also a step change in terms of sophistication compared to Neanderthals. But nevertheless, it's primitive technology, and good grief, in 150,000 years at maximum, we've put human beings on the moon, right? We are now conceiving of using technology that we invented to take evolution into our own hands, not only of life on Earth in general, but even human beings with the transhumanism movement. This means there's something special about human beings that distinguishes us from even Neanderthals. And people like Ian Tattersall say it was our language capability, right? It's a capacity for symbolism, and he argues there that humans had it, Neanderthals didn't. So, but in terms of that question, there's something going on with modern humans that you don't see in any other creature.
The only thing I disagree with is, was putting humans on the moon humanity's greatest technological achievement? I think the fact that we miniaturized felines, turned them into our pets, and then made a giant communications network to share funny videos of them, I think that's our greatest achievement.
Well, we're coming to the end of our program. Gentlemen, I appreciate your comments. I want to thank all the people who have participated in our live stream. If you like what you've heard here, or maybe you don't like it or disagree with it, leave a comment for us. We'd be glad to read it. There was a question about whether we're going to have more dialogues. We will. We have some planned to happen in the future. And of course, all of this is sponsored by the RTB scholar community. So let me close by simply saying that at RTB, we open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. So long.